As we ponder all that has been happening over the last several weeks, I was thinking about 2008. I was actually, I remember we were covering the campaign, and I had scheduled a trip, but long since had wanted to do this and had scheduled this long in advance of anything we had known about with the channel and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I went to Great Britain. I was doing the tour of Britain overseas for a few days. And at the time, we thought that the primary was going to be over, that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, by then she would be the nominee, probably. Instead, it turned out to be like 3 weeks of just fighting over Pennsylvania. It was a long period of time. It was the only primary that was yet to be decided in that month. If memory serves anyway, it was a long period of time, and Hillary Clinton eventually wound up winning. So I didn't really miss much except a back and forth over so many different things. Point being is that this is now not what 2008 was. We know how that one eventually turned out. It's not 2012 or 2016. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. So what exactly are we going to be dealing with when we get to Election Day, 211 days from now? Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, is joining us, tweeting at DRB Rosenberg. Bill, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Good morning.
Is it an oversimplification to say that the election this year, the presidential election, will be a referendum on the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think that's going to certainly be the most important feature that we're going to have to evaluate. You know, as political scientists, we often talk about this concept called retrospective voting. And the concept basically is that voters choose how to vote based upon an overall incumbent performance. And what we're seeing play out right now over the last 3 years is a performance of sorts, where President Trump has been the leader of our country. He's made a variety of decisions, including things like, can you remember travel bans? It seems like it was forever now that we think about Corona. But it started there, and it continued through tax cuts and other policies. But what's going to greatly overshadow everything is probably going to be the coronavirus and how it's being handled. And we're given an upfront look every day, not only in our daily lives about seeing how many things are closed down and how many opportunities of things we have are no longer available, like spending time with our family and such. But we're also seeing the impact of the health of the American public. And I think that the president gives us this inside view of how he's approaching it every day with his press conferences. And people are going to have to judge that. They're going to have to decide how well did the president do initially, how well is he doing now, and how well at the end did it all turn out. And President Trump did not cause the coronavirus to happen, but he's basically responsible in some ways for how he's dealing with it.
I was wondering, Ronald Reagan at one point had said, in his debate with Walter Mondale, you have to ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And I think back to 1992, when George H.W. Bush had massive approval ratings after the successful execution of the first Persian Gulf War. And then he wound up losing the election to Bill Clinton. And in this particular case now, we're talking about 211 days out from the election. It seems to me that people are maybe not going to say, am I better off than I was 4 years ago, but am I better off than I was 6 months ago?
Well, that question that Ronald Reagan raised and you just raised is a very interesting one, because Reagan did it at a time when there was very little introspection about what that statement maybe meant. When he said it, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, people just looked back 4 years ago and compared it to that time. That was tried also against Barack Obama at one time. And when Barack Obama was responding to that question, he sort of reformulated the response to it by saying, not just are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, but are you better off now with me than you would have been with my challenger in this current situation? And I think that's really the point at which the election is going to ultimately be framed also, in the sense that how would, for example, a Joe Biden have dealt with this in a different way than the way President Trump is dealing with it?
Again, Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. You mentioned Ronald Reagan in some of your notes, and Bill does notes for this so that I have an easy way to follow along with the bouncing ball here. But when he was shot in Washington, D.C., you had this great quote. He was in the hospital operating room, and he said, I hope you're all Republicans, to the doctors. And the Democratic surgeon, the liberal Democratic surgeon, says we're all Republicans today. There doesn't seem to be that much of that bipartisanship going around these days.
Well, I think the reason why I suggested that as an important idea is that we really are not seeing people in the scientific community attacking Donald Trump, the person. But you also don't see the medical community and the public health community towing the line of what President Trump is saying. It's kind of interesting in this daily briefing. We have two scientists on the stage and a surgeon general, and the way they approach it is very different. I think Dr. Bricks and the surgeon general tend to want to provide support for what President Trump is saying, using some scientific sort of backdrop to it. But interestingly, Tony Fauci is sort of a lone voice out there, sometimes agreeing with the president, often not challenge him directly in that press conference, but in other venues really raising the specter of what is really sort of incorrect or not a good perspective. And as a result, it's going to be interesting to see how Tony Fauci continues to last on this advisory committee. I think that, in terms of source credibility, I think if Americans look at it, they're going to think that maybe the head of the infectious disease agency is really the person they ought to listen to, a scientist, rather than the president of the United States, who last night, again, was saying, I'm not a doctor, but maybe you ought to think about taking these drugs.
I wonder about the approach that the former Vice President Joe Biden is taking relative to the president and relative to Bernie Sanders. He evidently had reached out to him and said, look, I'm going to start looking at campaign or at cabinet members. And there have been some calls for the former vice president to be much more open and critical of President Trump. Is there a playbook for this for him as well?
Well, I think we have to recognize that while politics operates on a big stage and a lot of dramatic activities, one of the things that often gets overlooked is that Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are actually friends. Earlier in the campaign, Bernie Sanders did not take the negative attack line against Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is trying to carefully, not only for political purposes, not offend Sanders supporters, but also not offend Bernie Sanders himself. So I think that they're doing an intricate dance. Many people within the Democratic Party leadership are trying to gently say to Bernie Sanders, look, you don't have an opportunity to win, so why don't you step back and help us win in November? And I think that's really what's going on. I think that Sanders, has sort of discovered that the United States has been moved in many ways by the suggestions that he has put forward in terms of wages, in terms of education, and in terms of health care. So he's been successful at shifting the agenda. But at the same time, many Americans don't seem so ready to move towards what he calls a revolution. So this is going to play out. It's going to take a while. Sanders, if the primary that's scheduled for this week does take place, it's going to probably put him further behind the eight ball, and he's going to have to make a calculation about whether or not he wants to go out in a real positive way or whether or not it's going to be conflict and confrontation all the rest of the way.
Dr. William Rosenberg. Bill, thanks so much for being here.
All right. Have a great day and stay safe.
You too, Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, taking you through some of the politics of coronavirus, tweeting at DR, as in doctor, at DRB Rosenberg.